So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Obviously, today we're here for Forensic Leadership. What traces will you leave? Just to quickly introduce myself, my name's Molly and I'm the event coordinator here at Kenton Victor Chamber. Just a couple of housekeeping rules, if that's okay. Please do keep your cameras on if possible. Keep your microphones on mute for me. And if you do have any questions, then just use the chat function. I think it's along the bottom of your screen there, and we'll all be able to see that and we can stop and ask questions or anything like that. The session is being recorded as well, so don't worry about taking lots and lots of notes because you can watch it back. Nice and quick introductions. If I can now hand over and introduce you to Paul. Paul is from the Selfless Leadership Group.
That's easy for you to say. Morning, yeah, I am Paul Kincaid. I'm pleased to meet you all and thanks for having me along. I founded Selfless Leadership Group about 4 years ago, based on a 20-year career in the military before that. And what I want to share with you today is a leadership theory that was developed during my military career and that I talk about quite a lot out in industry as well, mainly because we just never stop and think about our own leadership style. We just push on and we just do things. And I'm just going to share a screen as well. It won't be death by PowerPoint, don't worry. There's only a couple of slides. So it's going to be forensic leadership. And in order to talk to you about that, I need to take you a little bit on my own story as well and how I came across it. So we're going to go back to 1978 for that. When I was a wee 5-year-old boy, I was army barmy, absolutely army crazy. And either out of a lack of imagination or grit and determination, I'll let you decide which one, 20 years later, I joined the army. So I went to the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. It was a dream come true. And in 1998, I deployed immediately overseas on my first operation to the Balkans. And it was during that time that I started practicing the art of leadership, the way that Sandhurst teaches it, which is a very servant leader approach. Their motto is serve to lead. So you can start to get an idea of how leadership is taught during that time. Anyway, it's winter 97 into 98, and I'm 26 years old, and I'm in charge of 28 soldiers, all male at the time. And in the valley next to us, we were in sort of small tanks called Warrior Armoured Fighting Vehicles. And in the valley next to us, the unit next door came into some contact. They were getting shot at by some bad dudes. And we were asked to go and help. So we decided we were going to head out to the end of the valley, turn left again, and the cavalry would arrive and would save the day and be home in time for tea and medals. Now, the thaw had started to happen. After the pretty bleak winter, the thaw had started to happen. And sometimes a thaw out there causes landslips. And that had happened this day. And you're recommended not to drive over a landslip in the Balkans at that time, because sometimes, it can bring down a landmine in the slip onto the road. Now, our friends around the corner were in trouble. And so it fell to me at 25 years old, 26 years old, to decide whether to go over that landslip or not. I took the advice of my 21-year-old driver, who's a young Lance Corporal. And he said, boss, they're in trouble, let's do it. So we did. We went over the landslip. And that's when the explosion happened. All senses disappeared, much like you see in the films. And then one sense came back slowly, one at a time. First was smell, second was vision, then it was hearing, and then everything else came flooding in quite quickly. So the smell of the burnt earth, the smell of the explosion was pervasive, and then started to see what's happening. And then as the noise came back, as the hearing came back, I heard my driver screaming. The explosion had taken both of his legs off in the front of the tank. So he's there 21 years old. I'm 25 years old. I'm in charge of 28 people. First explosion, and I didn't know what to do. I was hurting, I was bleeding, and then it suddenly realized that I'm in charge here and I've got to do something. So Corporal, I won't share his name because his parents obviously don't know that I necessarily talk about him, and I'm still in touch with his parents. But the Lance Corporal was pulled into the back of the vehicle from the driver's compartment. And he was well known throughout the platoon that he had a letter for his father in his top left-hand pocket. It became a bit of a joke. It was always, where's the letter? It's in my top left pocket. Every time before we went out on patrol, the letter's in my pocket if anything happens. Well, this day something happened, and the letter was in his top pocket, and he took it out, gave it to me and said, give this to my dad. So I gave it back to him, as you do, said, listen, give it to your dad. You're going to be fine. And in 1998 was a day before we routinely carried tourniquets. And, you know, without wishing to go into too much detail, the guy was in trouble. And within 35, 40 seconds, it became clear that he was going to die. The soldier was going to die in my lap, holding my hand with the letter in his pocket. He got the letter out again, said, give this to my dad. So I took it off him, put it in my top left pocket so he could see exactly where it was. And within 5 seconds, 10 seconds of that, he started to hallucinate. And at 26 years old, I became this 21-year-old's father, and he begged forgiveness. So what do you do? What do you do in that situation? I held his hand, I bent down, I gave him a kiss on the head, told him that he had nothing to be forgiven for, that me and his mum were very proud of him. And within the next few seconds, he passed away in my lap. That profound incident changed the way I viewed leadership for the rest of my life. And how I stood, sorry, I've got such a croaky throat at the moment, changed the way I viewed leadership for the rest of my life. It became clear that leadership for me had to come from a position of care. I loved that guy. I loved all the soldiers I've commanded over the years in a entirely appropriate way, but you get so close that all you can do is care about them. And so sometimes I tell them difficult things, but in a nice way. You know, you're not ready for the promotion yet because you'll let yourself down, you'll let everyone else down. Maybe next year is your time. But that was done from a position of care. And I cared about this guy, and it became very clear that doing the right thing was leaning down and kissing him on the head. So that was my awakening, if you like, to leadership and the way it was done, the way I was going to do it differently. And from that point forward, I made leadership my profession, which might sound a little bit odd for an army officer because all army officers lead, but I decided to study it as well. And I watched and observed leadership all around the world. In a 20-year career, I've traveled over 44 countries and commanded soldiers on 5 of the world's 7 continents, doing things from the extreme pointy end of foreign policy down to business as usual in barracks and more office style work. A couple of years later, I was involved in another operation and I came across the work of this chap. And this isn't, for those of you of a certain age, this is not Johnny Morris from Animal Magic, the guy who used to do the voices for the penguins and that sort of thing. This is a guy called Dr. I'll try it once. So I was speaking to Molly beforehand. I'm not a linguist. This is Dr. Edmond Locard. For those of you who weren't familiar, that's French for Edmond Locard. I'll stick with the English version for now. So Dr. Edmond Locard, 1910, became the father of forensic science. And we're already familiar with his work because we've watched CSI, we've watched Silent Witness, we've watched Columbo, we've watched Vera, we've seen news articles about terrible crimes. So we know what Dr. Edmond Locard wrote down in 1910, which was his exchange principle. The Locard exchange principle states basically that every time the criminal enters a crime scene, they leave a trace, a fingerprint, DNA, a footprint, you know, whatever that might be. And the crime scene leaves a trace on them as well. A fleck of paint, a carpet fiber, whatever that might be. Now, whether forensic scientists can find that trace or not is utterly irrelevant. The trace is there. So his exchange principle is taught the world over on all sorts of forensic investigation, all criminal justice system activity. And it's been beautifully condensed down into this simple phrase: every contact leaves a trace. Well, it struck me, if you lift that entire theory up and drop that into the leadership domain, it remains constant. It's still true. Every contact leaves a trace. But leaders, unlike the criminal, we have a choice about which traces we leave behind. And so what we've done over the few years is, if you chop those down into different organizations, into different colors rather, red is a bad trace, green is a good trace. If I was to take you all off mute and ask you now, I won't, don't worry, but if I was to ask you all now to share your experience of a bad leader, you would go there immediately. You would feel very similar feelings that you felt when that bad leader, I refer to those people as chumps. You can delete and insert whichever word you prefer, but I'll stick with chump for now. You've all had those bad experiences, be it a child with a parent or guardian, be it a child with a school teacher or a coach, sports coach, be it a worker with a boss, wherever it is, you have had and experienced a bad leadership experience. That has left a trace on you, a red trace that creates a physiological, visceral response. And if I start asking you about that, you will experience some of that reaction again. Perhaps your heart rate will go up. You might roll your eyes. Your thought process will go back to that chump that left that red trace. I can't believe they did that. I don't believe they treated me that way. Or I can't believe they said that out loud. Or are they aware of how they're landing when they say that? Or just walk out of the room shaking your head with your head in your hands or whatever it is. Those red traces embed themselves in our cerebral cortex in a very different way to the green traces. So through forensic leadership, we can explore what those red traces are. Equally, we can explore the green because they're fantastic. But if we start to look, and there's plenty of science that sits behind this, if we start to look at the ease of leaving a trace, be that green or red, and the impact of that same trace, green or red, some interesting things start to happen. So the ease of leaving a red trace on a scale of 1 to 10 sits around about 1 to 3. It is very, very easy to be a bad leader and leave a bad trace, a red trace on someone. Equally, it's very easy to leave a green trace. That sits on a 1 to 3 and a scale of 1 to 10 as well. If we look at the impact that those traces have, the impact of a red trace generally, and there's hundreds of people who have put their statistics into this, generally it sits around about 8 to 10 on that same sliding scale, but in terms of impact. So to leave a red trace, that hits people and it hits them hard and it stays with them for a very, very long time. So even so, if you start to witness the same sort of behavior in another leader, you'll immediately put them into the red leader box. You'll make a judgment on that individual, fairly or unfairly, you'll make that judgment. Green traces, the impact those leave sits at about a 6 to 8. It's very difficult to leave a green trace that has a huge impact up at 10. Okay, so immediately, hopefully what you're thinking is, oh, I wonder what traces I leave behind. That would be nice, wouldn't it, given that's the title of the talk. But what traces have been left on you? You will have had green traces. You can role model great leaders. And the interesting thing about role modeling is that if you imagine a great leader, Nelson Mandela, there are very few people in the world who say that Nelson Mandela was a bad leader, but it's very dangerous to role model, because if I view Nelson Mandela as a great role model and I want to be like him, then essentially, I don't know if you can see the camera, I do that. I try and operate in this space and I try and do everything like Nelson would have done. That's not authentic me. That's me role playing, trying to be Nelson Mandela. And a lot of leaders step into a leadership appointment and try and role play what they think a leader should be. Rather, they were promoted or given that appointment because of who they are, not of who they might be. And so to try and operate in this space and be Nelson Mandela is not authentic. So I much prefer to take slices of those green leaders that I've come across, and that allows me to explore that space as well and be truly me and authentic, but employ little bits of green leaders that I've come across and ignore the red. Because they're chumps, aren't they? We've already decided the red leaders are chumps. Let's put a little bit of statistics around that and just see where we go with it. Last year, 2019, let's ignore 2020. It hasn't happened, right? 2020 has just been a gap in time that never happened. 2019, 79% of people who voluntarily left their Employment in the UK cited a lack of recognition as the key reason for leaving. So not reward, nothing like that. Basically, not enough green traces were left on these individuals. We didn't notice them enough. We didn't say thank you. And very low level things like that. So let's go back to the ease of leaving a green trace. Sits at 1 to 3. All we need to do is say thank you. Notice people, care about people. Our philosophy in my organization is great leadership comes from a position of care. I said that at the beginning, and if we care properly and notice people, then we can't help but leave a green trace. And what I would say about that is just saying thank you isn't enough. We need to give evidence for that. You know, Molly, thanks very much for organizing this. I understand, you know, it's not an easy thing to do to pull these people together and do all the administration for it. That means I've noticed what Molly has done to get today to happen. Because if I just walk in and say, oh, thanks, Molly, you're doing a great job. It doesn't take long for Molly to go, yeah, that doesn't mean anything. It's a meaningless thanks. So we need to provide the evidence for that as well. So let's just look at those statistics again. 79% of people, 8 out of 10 people left their job because they weren't told thank you enough, essentially. That's not because red traces were left, it's because not enough green were left. So let's ignore red traces. How can we leave more green? Let's go deeper into those 8 out of 10 people. It costs on average in the UK to recruit someone from advertisement all the way through to fully operational, i.e. the onboarding is over and they can be left alone to do their job. It costs between £5,000 and £50,000 per person, depending on what role responsibilities they have. Granted, that's a pretty big swing. We can't afford not to leave green traces, especially after the year that never happened. 2020 has been rubbish. We can't afford not to notice people, not to leave green traces and have that positive impact on people, can we? So if we say thank you a bit more, leave more green traces, people become more engaged at work. Work is a place people want to come to rather than throw a sickie to avoid. So if we're mindful of every contact leaves a trace and we are good leaders, our team vicariously grows and becomes better and closer. They start to offer discretionary effort, which means they do more. They don't just do what is required and go home at 5 o'clock. If the job needs doing, a lot of people will end up staying and doing it. People will mutually support one another. The team becomes high performing rather than a group of individuals who draw a pay packet at the end of the month and go home. Work becomes a place where people come to complain about home rather than people going home to complain about work. Wouldn't that be nice? Not complaining about home, but work being a place to come to. So again, statistically, we can demonstrate that good leadership equates to enhanced employee engagement. Those two things combine to enhanced employee well-being. Those things mean, firstly, we don't have people laying awake at night worrying about coming to work because they're working for a chump. We've all seen the statistics. 76% of people, 60% of people leave a bad boss, not a job. Well, if we think about our leadership approaches, then we can have a positive impact on those people. And then amazing things happen. As leaders in businesses, we are focused, and rightly so, on the bottom line, on the profit and loss. We need to be, of course we do. But if we focus on our people, good leadership equates to better employee engagement, enhanced employee engagement, leads to enhanced well-being, reduced staff turnover, which means reduced recruitment costs. And it can relate to up to a 20% increase in profit per year, up to a 20% increase in productivity per year. And for those of you who have shareholders, up to 134% increase in share value. And this is the critical factor, a better experience for our clients and customers, because our people are happy at work, and happiness is hugely contagious, hugely contagious. So when people feel comfortable at work because they are being covered in green traces on a daily basis, then they're going to be better to the clients, they're going to be nicer to the clients. Now, I've just said a phrase there about covering our staff in green traces on a daily basis. I'm going to throw another statistic out, and I'm sorry if it seems a bit stat heavy, but this one is absolutely shocking. In 2019, on average, a UK employee was criticised at work once every 2 weeks. You know, you could have done it this way. What did you think of that? Did you not think of doing it this way? You know, I would have preferred it to look like this. Why didn't you paint it green? You know, silly things, silly examples like that are all criticism of individual once every 2 weeks. On average, in the UK in 2019, a member of staff was praised once every 4.5 months. Praised once every 4.5 months, criticised once every 2 weeks. That's a ratio of 19 to 1. 19 red traces being left on that individual for every 1 green trace. That is appalling. You wouldn't stay in an environment where you're criticised 19 times for 1 praise. We shouldn't expect our staff to do the same thing. I'm not suggesting you guys on this call are that leader, are that chump, God forbid. You're here, which implies that you're interested in leadership, which implies that you're a great leader already. And I love working with great leaders because great leaders know they can always be better. I don't like working with leaders who go, no, I don't need to know anything about leadership. Well, au contraire, my friend. So isn't that interesting that those statistics, 19 to 1, that is absolutely shocking. Absolutely shocking. So we've got the statistics that sit around this forensic leadership thing, and we've got this leadership from a position of care. And leadership from a position of care, let's just look at that, doesn't mean being pink and fluffy. I've shared a little bit of my career history with you, so you'll probably be happy with the fact that I'm not a pink and fluffy chap. You won't be able to tell, but I'm 6'5", I'm 16 stone, I'm a rugby playing grrr type chap. Not that that means anything, but I care. I genuinely care about those around me. And I demonstrate that in a variety of different ways, because the care that is demonstrated is not the pink and fluffy kind. It's not constantly putting arms around people, you know, the slightly patronizing way that a lot of people fall into, that misconception around coaching and around leadership development and around, you know, this care approach. As I suggested earlier on, a caring approach is being quite transparent and quite truthful, providing that quite new modern phrase of psychological safety, allowing people to speak up when they think that something's wrong, and not criticizing people, allowing people to fail early and not beating them up for it. So the example I spoke about earlier on of leading from a position of care is that I got a friend of mine who's a BA pilot, and he wants to, a co-pilot, and he wants to promote to a captain of his own aircraft. And he's really keen to do it, but he's not ready. He knows he's not ready. And we spoke about how his boss let him know that he's not ready, technically, and in a number of other ways as well. But he was told in a way that, you know, you have the responsibility of 200 odd lives behind you, the crew around you, the aircraft. And, you know, that's a big responsibility. But more importantly, the stress and anxiety of being put into that position of responsibility before you're ready is irresponsible of us to do that for you. And it was that hit home, because he knows that if he spends enough time in the simulator and reads enough manuals and practices long enough, he'll be good enough technically to fly the aircraft. But they have decided, for whatever reason, that he's not quite ready, and out of a position of care, they are concerned that that additional responsibility might have a negative impact on him. So that's where I come from with this position of care. So my question to you guys is, what traces do you leave behind? What will you leave behind? I'm not finished, don't worry, but as a result of today, what traces will you leave behind? What traces are left on you in your organization? Too often, a leader assumes that it is their responsibility to motivate those around them. And I'm going to suggest that that's not the case. Well prepared for you to throw stones at that afterwards if you want to. But broadly, there are two groups of people in the UK, or in the world actually. There are those that are motivated by opportunity. So you go in and say, we've got this great opportunity to sell a brand new type of electric razor that is rechargeable in sunlight, and it's fantastic, and it can do men's faces, it can do legs, it can do armpits, it can do whatever you want, and no, blemishes on the skin, whatever. It's a magic razor. There'll be a portion in the room, and you tell that to, who go, this is fantastic, let's do that. We can see the profit, we can see the marketing opportunities, we can see all shiny things, the magpies, if you like, who see shiny things and go for it. There'll be another portion of people in the room who we might look at as negative and dissenters, who will go, that's all well and good, but what about this? What about the battery recharge? Remember a few years ago, there was a Samsung phone that if you recharged it, it would burst into flames or something, and it was a couple of times on an aircraft it happened. What about if that type of battery is put in? What about this? What if? And they're looking at reputational impact, they're looking at risk. So they're problem avoiders. They are motivated by avoiding and solving a problem. They are not bad people. Those two groups of people are really important, and we need to play to both of those. So for us as leaders to get up in front of everyone and say, right, and we've all experienced leaders like this, pin your ears back, everybody, I'm about to motivate you. And then they give this great speech, at which point a portion of the room leave saying, yeah, that was great. And the other portion, normally a bigger portion, leave going, I'm not so sure. That didn't really cut it for me. It didn't scratch the itch. So what we need to consider when we're leading from a forensic position is, how do people need to hear things? Listen through another person's ears. Stop before we go in and give that motivational address. What do we actually need to give? It's probably just the information. And because they're adults and they're at work, we can assume they can motivate themselves. And one or two people might not be able to do that. But it's not our job to motivate them. It's our job to create the conditions whereby they can seek out motivation. And there's a nuance in there that won't be lost on you. It's our job to create the conditions for them to motivate themselves, not our job to motivate them. And we can do that through the traces that we leave behind, by making sure that we enhance the green and minimize the red. Notice I've said minimize the red, not eradicate, because sometimes we leave red traces and we can't avoid that. We need to forgive ourselves when we do. We need to apologize when we do and acknowledge that we have. Bless you, Molly. But we don't need to necessarily beat ourselves up about it. We make mistakes. We're humans. People in a leadership appointment are under stress, are under pressure, and sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes that will leave a negative impact on people. And we need to acknowledge it, forgive ourselves, and apologize for it. If we go back to the decision that I made to go over that roadblock in 1998 in the Balkans, that resulted in the fatality of my driver, a very, very good professional soldier. I regret the loss, but would I make that decision again? Absolutely, I would, because we were going to help a larger group of people who needed our help. Now, in actual fact, we never got there, obviously. And luckily, nothing bad happened as a result of us not being able to make it. But would I make the same decision again? Yeah, I think I would. So I've had to almost forgive myself for making that decision, regardless of the terrible impact that it had on that individual and his family. And as I say, I'm still in contact with the family now. And they've forgiven me, which is a beautiful thing and is testament to them as a family. But let's bring it back into our lives, into much more real life. Not that wasn't real life, it was very much real life. But in a day-to-day business, we generally don't run over minefields in the UK, thankfully. So let's be kind to ourselves as leaders. Let's not role model what we think a leader should be. Let's be us in that leadership appointment. Let's stop before we make decisions and make sure that any impact it has is as green as possible. But here's the thing. We also need to own our own reactions when other people leave traces upon us. So there might be a chump who leaves red traces on you routinely. That may be their fault. But like I suggested earlier on, as adults, we motivate ourselves. As adults, we control how we react to that red trace. So we might want to think about, before next time we meet with that chump, because every meeting ends up a red outcome, what do we need to do in order to try to create the conditions for the outcome of that next meeting to be as green as possible? How do we own our reaction to that? And that's the only thing we can do and have control over. And lo and behold, it might be that that relationship becomes greener. Which brings me on to this next point and the final point, whereby if you want to, in your organizations, you can quantify forensic leadership. You can allocate a score to the interactions that you have with people, from a -5 to +5, -3 to +3, whatever you want to score it. -5 being a really bad interaction. I never want to see that individual again. I'm probably going to lay awake fretting about it tonight. Through to green, and you know, what a fantastic person. Basically, I want to be them. That was a wonderful interaction. I feel great as a result. And in my future, I want more of them through me, and I want to be that kind of leader. And the range in between, from -5 to +5 or -3 to +3. And over time, you can start scoring each meeting. And you'll find out that you predominantly have red meetings with an individual, and you predominantly have green meetings with a bunch of individuals. That allows you, as the owner of that reaction to the trace, to focus your energy on the red ones. Maintain the green, of course, maintain the green, and see if you can knock that up a couple of points, of course. But it's the red trace that is having the biggest impact on you. It'll stay for longer, it'll hurt for longer, and it'll hang around like a bad smell. So what can you do to own your reaction to that red chump and try and make your reaction more green? And you can encourage people in your workplace to do the same thing. Now, sharing those scores, creating a map of your organization, like a human terrain analysis map, that's something that you might think about doing. It's very, very subjective, and it's very complicated. And getting people to open up about their true feelings about colleagues is a very harsh challenge. Because if someone's leaving red on you, are you likely to sit in the same room and say, that person over there, they're a chump because they leave red on me? Unlikely. Now, I've worked with a couple of organizations that have wanted me to do that and call people out. It's very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. But if we're courageous enough to do it, it results in teams getting so much closer together and very, very high performing. Because it might be, actually, there's only one red leader in the organization, and they might not be a cultural fit, a temperamental fit, and you might have to have a difficult decision and a difficult discussion with that individual to explain that they're not a cultural fit. And then your whole organization becomes green. And the impact of that one person, one rotten apple, you know, there are phrases, aren't there, that resonate in that area. So that was the last point, really, is what are you going to do about your traces that you leave on other people? And they will react in the way that they react. You can't control that. You can control your traces, but what else you can control is how you react to the traces that are left upon you as one of the led. So we can do that up the chain of command, we can do that out, and we can do that down. Leaders don't just look down. We can give feedback to our boss as well, from a position of care, if we've got a boss, and say, do you know what, when you do that, it makes me feel like this. I wonder if we might be able to work together to try and sort something out. That depends how much they are on the chomp scale as to whether you can have that conversation up front or not. But what green traces are left in your organization, what red traces are left, and critically, what traces do you leave behind? And even more critically than that, after today, what traces will you leave behind? Because now, every time you watch something like Silent Witness, Vera, CSI, read a terrible story in the newspaper, you will remember forensic leadership, and it'll give you a little kick up the backside to what traces am I going to leave tomorrow? And on that note, I'll see if you've got any questions.